So we welcome here Professor Alan Kirman, and we're very pleased to have you here at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in this INET conference. And
Alan Kirman is a Professor Emeritus at l'Université d'Aix-Marseille III and l'École des Hautes Études in Sciences Sociales. Professor, in your paper, Whom or What Does the Representative Individual Represent? Is one of the most important works on the methodology of the representative agent. But what are the implications of such a methodology for the result of macroeconomic research?
Yeah, it's a very important problem because we are one of the rare disciplines where what we have done is say we're interested in how people, individuals behave, and then we're also interested in how the aggregate behaves. We're worried about aggregate behavior. Most of the problems we're interested in, unemployment, inflation, all these things are aggregate problems. And we say we want to base this on how individuals behave. Now, in most disciplines, when you have individuals who interact together, what happens at the aggregate level does not look like what happens to each individual. If you look at an ant colony, you don't take the average ant and have a look at him and see what he's doing to understand how the whole thing functions. You would have no idea what was going on.
So there is no representative ant?
No, there isn't a representative ant, and he has very local and limited information, but collectively they get a lot done. So collective behavior is different from individual behavior. And yet in economics we've really pushed the idea that you have to somehow treat the aggregate as if it were an individual. And so you say, well, let's take the representative individual. And in some disciplines you do that. In physics sometimes you have a mean field approximation and so forth. But in economics it's a discipline where it really doesn't make sense to think of the aggregate as behaving like your individual and trying to reduce the whole complex problem of how the aggregate behaves to looking at this one individual and how he behaves. He has to be very complicated, very sophisticated, and people are not very complicated and not very sophisticated, but the interaction between them generates very complicated and sophisticated behavior. But we shouldn't put that down to this one guy who's sitting there in the middle and who's highly rational, extremely intelligent, far-sighted and so forth. No, it's really due to the interaction between them that we get what we see at the aggregate level. And I think that has undermined our whole discipline. And macroeconomic textbooks, still when you open them, what do you see? The representative agent, you work with that model. Then you say, well, we have to relax that, we have to have other things, but that's the sort of benchmark, and it shouldn't be the benchmark. So that's why I think it's a fundamental problem. But many people have read the article, as you said, and many people have commented on it, but not much changed in macroeconomics. So I don't have any claim to having done much.
In fact, in your latest book, Complex Economics, you present many features of aggregate system. And what's the role, for example, of heterogeneity, networks, and emerging properties in macroeconomics?
Okay, well, let's take them one at a time. Heterogeneity. Why is it interesting to deal with different agents? Well, most of the activity in economics is due to the fact that people are different and they're doing different things and therefore they need to interact with other people. Think of a market. Sometimes you even see models of the market for foreign exchange in which you have a representative trader. But that doesn't make sense. I mean, these guys are trading with each other for reasons, because they're different, they have different expectations. And yet we want to have rational expectations where everybody has the same expectations. And so when we have heterogeneous agents, they have different expectations. I want to trade with you because I expect something different to happen in the future. Or I want to insure myself against something which I think may be risky and you don't think it's very risky. And so we are constantly interacting with other people who are different from us. And if you look at the structure of industry, look at the structure of the organization of our economy, it's full of people who are very different, doing very different things. And most of them are unaware of what the others are doing. But somehow we interact and coordinate together. And although it's a person that I really don't like very much, Hayek had in fact this sort of vision of people as having local information which they sort of communicated to each other, but it was never all present in some central mind. And so again, we come back to the representative individual. If everybody was the same, the problem would be very simple, but we wouldn't really have an economy. Okay, once we say they're heterogeneous and that they interact, well, who interacts with whom? And that's why you look at networks. Because, you know, the people who influence you, the things you do, are not the same people necessarily as influence him, or certainly not the same as influence people in England and so. But you're influenced by other people all the time. You trade with them, you discuss with them, your expectations change because I'm in contact with this person and he says to me, you know, I'm pretty optimistic about what's going on. He said, oh, well, I was pretty pessimistic, but maybe I've become a bit more optimistic because I talked to you. And that sort of thing is very important, those network effects. Look at banks, for example. What we've done until very recently is say, I want to look at a bank and see whether it's solid or not. We have to do stress tests on the bank. But then a lot of people like Andy Haldane at the Bank of England and a lot of other people like Bob May, the ecologist, have said, look, what you should look at is not the individual banks, but where they're placed in this network. How dependent are the other banks on them? If something happens to this bank, it's not just whether this bank can survive, it's whether it has an impact on other banks. And Frank Schweitzer, a physicist in Zurich, has a very nice map of the banks that collapsed in the United States during the crisis. And there are hundreds of them. And if you look, you can see the network. You can see which banks were linked to which other banks, and you can see how it spread, like an epidemic of flu. It wasn't, you know, that somehow from outside this happened. It was because these banks were dependent on each other. I'd made loans to you and so forth, or I'd taken a position with you, or I had I hold shares in your bank, and I'm another bank. And so we depend on each other, and if we don't look at the network of dependencies, we miss all that aspect. And the last thing was networks.
The last thing was emerging properties.
Yeah, emerging properties, and that's an important idea also. That when you have all these people interacting like this, out of it comes something which you wouldn't necessarily anticipate by looking at the individuals. You know, the classic example that everybody knows, because it's very easy and it's very beautiful, is Schelling's segregation model, where people are not very prejudiced, you know. They're prepared to have half the other people around them different from them. They don't care. But even with that, the thing segregates completely. And that's not something you'd expect. If you'd taken your average guy and said, oh, he's pretty tolerant, you know, he probably lives in an area with other people different from him. And then you look at the result, and what emerged from that interaction between those people are these patterns which you couldn't possibly get from looking at one individual or a representative or an average individual. So those emergent properties are very important. And a lot of things that happen in the economy are emergent properties. They're not properties you can get by studying this guy who was thinking in his corner. You know?
And so with these new complex economic models, what new implication do you expect to emerge for fiscal and monetary macroeconomic policies? So,
well, let me give you the first part of the answer is that a good friend of mine who's one of the executive directors of the Bank of England, I'll spare him the misery of giving you his name, but he said to me, Alan, you know, I'm very interested in what you do, but I have to set interest rates. Tell me, you know, how that helps me to set interest rates. And I said to him, I think the problem is that it's just what you just said. You want to set interest rates, one thing. And the whole approach of complex systems would suggest that you shouldn't be focusing on one variable. It's very difficult to control a system like that through one variable. There are many other variables that you should think about, and you should think of the impact of what you're doing on those. And if you say, I just have to decide on this one variable, you miss, in some sense, the whole point of the complex system approach. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that the way we currently build macro models is to say what we develop is some nice causal relationships. If you do this, then this will happen. And we said, well, our models are not perfect, so we can't tell you exactly, but that's pretty much how it works. And as we get better and better at building these models, we'll better tell you better and better, when you do that, this is what will happen. And that's what, you know, people thought of it as being a science. Valras wanted it to be a science. He said it's going to be like astrophysics. Economics is going to become like astrophysics, just as pure and beautiful. You know, and that will never be the case. And the point is that these causal models, we can't really build those. We can't really ever say, if you do this, then that will happen. And once you say that, then you say, well, maybe then I can't make these assertions that if we change this tax rate by that much, if we change the interest rate by that much, then this is what will happen. And that's why we're always making such bad forecasts. I mean, you must notice all the time that regularly we pay a lot of attention to the forecasts that these models make, right? You say, good heavens, France had surprisingly good growth. That's what we heard just yesterday. And it said it was 0.3% and not 0.1 as we thought. So that's really good. And then they say, but this was surprisingly good growth. But it wasn't surprisingly good growth. It was unsurprisingly bad forecasting, because in our models we can't forecast very well. And so what we're doing is basing our monetary policy, our fiscal policy, on the idea that we know what will happen when we do something. And we have to drop that idea. We have to say, I think as we watch the economy evolve, we have to try and move it, control it. It's like optimal control theory. You know? And that's something that Janet Yellen has started to take on board at the Federal Reserve Board. She starts to say now, instead of saying, we're going to do this now, and then we're going to do that. And then she said, well, we're going to try and change people's expectations. But now she says, we will watch it. And as it evolves, we will decide whether or not we're going to raise interest rates, whether or not we want to do some extra stimulus and so forth. So instead of being people who are sort of pulling levers and moving the economy, we're people who are watching the economy and trying to influence it in the right direction. Andy Haldane had a very nice image where he said, in the future, I would like to think of myself like Dr. Spock. I would be faced with a map of all the financial activity in the world, and I would just watch and see, there's a storm developing here. Then I should really think about what we should do about that. And there's a storm. And so as we get more and more detailed information, I would become a sort of informed spectator who tries to influence things, but not somebody who makes pronouncements that we are going to do this, and then that will happen, you know. Just as a last point on, for example, after this famous 0.3%, they said, but this is only a 2% error. That's nothing, right? It's a 300% error. You know, if you say 0.1 and it's 0.3, that's 300% error. It's not a 2% error. But the point is that the government has made a budget on the basis of their forecast. And they said we have to slash public spending by this much, right? But now it's 0.3%. Are they going to turn around quickly and say, oh, we don't have to slash it by that much? Of course not, because the way they work is to think, we had this forecast, this is our plan, here's our budget, and it didn't work out, that was somehow a surprise, so we can't modify our budget now. And we shouldn't be working like that. We should be reacting and trying to influence, but not claiming that we can really understand perfectly how the economy works. Mervyn King, who was the governor of the Bank of England, is an old friend of mine. He said at some point, we should avoid the hubris of thinking that we understand how the economy works. We don't.
Okay, so we thank you very much, Professor Alan Kirman, for your interesting insights. And
it was a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to be back at Scuola Sant'Anna.
Yeah.